Hey everyone, it's Miss Brooks with your Daily Dose of Math. Today we're going to be studying section 7 of chapter 1 called Absolute Value Equations. So the first thing you need to know is some background information. So the absolute value is the distance a number is from zero. So we would think about a number line and then think how far away is that number from zero. When we think about the distance is always a positive number because you cannot go a negative distance. So when we talk about absolute value of a number will always be positive. When we talk about absolute value, the way we'll know if absolute value is in our problem is we're going to have this special notation, these two vertical bars. So those two vertical bars are the notation for absolute value. So now it's time to take a look at some basic examples. Our first example says the absolute value of -5 equals. So what we want to do to figure out what the absolute value of a number is we're going to picture a number line. So I drew a number line at the bottom of this slide, and what we are going to do is start at the number inside the absolute value. So in this case, we are starting at -5. So I'm going to put a dot above -5. Now we do not need to draw the number line. You can if you wish. So since absolute value is representing the distance from zero, we want to count how many spaces are we from zero. So from -5, I would count we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units from zero. And since absolute value is representing a distance, and distance always has to be positive, we would say that the absolute value of -5 is 5, because it took us 5 times to get to the number 0. Now, the second example says the absolute value of +5. So when I find the absolute value of +5, what I'm going to do is same thing, picture my number line, and if I start at +5, so I'm going to draw a dot at +5, and I want to count how far away am I from 0. So if I count, I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units away from 0. Again, since distance is always positive and absolute value is distance, we would say that the absolute value of 5 is also 5. So it's basically saying that this number is that many spaces away from 0. Now you try finding the absolute value of -7 and the absolute value of 0. So if we think about the absolute value of -7, we want to know how far is -7 from 0. Well, since the absolute value represents a distance, -7 would be 7 units from 0. So the absolute value of -7 is 7. Similarly, the absolute value of 0, we want to know how far away is 0 from itself. Well, 0 is right at 0, so the absolute value of 0 is 0. Our next example says find the absolute value of x when it equals 5. So the absolute value of x equals 5. First thing you want to know is when you solve absolute value problems, you are more than likely going to get 2 answers. Pretty much every single time you're going to get 2 answers to the problem. So what I do to solve these problems when it says the absolute value of x equals 5, I always set up 2x equals. So I make sure I get 2 answers, because both the numbers to the left and to the right of the number line are the same distance away from 0. So I need to have a positive answer and a negative answers for problems like absolute value of x equals 5. So when I do this, what number is 5 units away from 0? Well, that could be +5, as we saw in example 2, or that could be -5, as we saw in example 1. So the answers to this would be x could be +5 or x could be -5. If we look at this fourth example, the fourth example says the absolute value of x equals 0. So if I set up my two problems, x equals and x equals, I would want to set the first x equal to a positive 0 and the second x equal to a negative 0. Now, since there is no such thing as a positive 0 and negative 0, this is the only time we're going to have one answer. We're not going to say x is positive 0, x is negative 0. There is only one 0. And that is the only time that you will be 0 units away from 0 on the number line. So the absolute value of x equals 0 would be when x is 0. So now you try finding when the absolute value of x equals 10 and when does the absolute value of x equals 3. So the absolute value of x would equal 10 when x is 10. Or when x is negative 10. For the second you try, the absolute value of x would be positive 3 when x is 3, or when x is negative 3. Because the absolute value of both of those numbers is 3 units away from 0. So now we're going to take a look at solving some absolute value equations. So there are 3 main steps to solve absolute value equations. For right now, we're going to focus just on step 2 and step 3. We will already have problems where the absolute value is isolated. So step 1 is actually already going to be done for us in the problems that we do right now. We're going to look at step 2, where we have to write 2 equations, and step 3 where we have to solve both equations. So example 5 says the absolute value of x plus 3 is equal to 8. So when we solve absolute value problems, we want the absolute value to be the only thing on one side of the equation. Since the absolute value is the only thing on the left side of the equals, we're going to jump to step 2, which says set up 2 equations. So we're going to rewrite what's inside the absolute value bars, x plus 3, and we're going to say that inside that could be equal to positive 8, because the absolute value of 8 would give us 8. Then we're also going to set up a second equation where what's on the inside could also equal a negative 8. So when we solve absolute value equations, we need to set up 2 equations. One where we equal the positive number and one where we equal the negative number. Because the absolute value of 8 and negative 8 would both be 8 units from 0. So once you set up both equations, you just solve each one for x. So subtract 3 on both sides. The first one tells us that x would be 5. Subtract 3 on the other side. The second one tells us that x would be negative 8 minus 3, which is negative 11. So when we write our answers, we don't usually write x equals 5, x equals negative 11. We will draw these little swiggle brackets and then write our 2 answers with a comma separated. So just do your best to draw the swiggle brackets. I'm not going to judge you on them being perfect, but the more you do it, the better you'll get. So our second example here, example 6, says the absolute value of 2x plus 1 equals 3. So since the absolute value is all by itself on the left side of the equals, we're going to take what's inside the absolute value bars, 2x plus 1, and use it to set up our 2 equations. So 2x plus 1 on the inside could equal positive 3, or 2x plus 1 could be equal to a negative 3, because the absolute values of positive 3 and negative 3 would both give us 3. So if we solve each equation for x, we're going to subtract 1. So 2x is with 2. And then divide 2. So the first one tells us x is 1. For the second equation, we're subtracting 1. So 2x is with negative 4. And then divide 2. So x, negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So when I write my final answer, 1 and negative 2.